Today we're exploring a captivating question: does the Chinese Communist Party still possess its seemingly miraculous luck? Those familiar with the history of Communist China know that, from its inception, the CCP has endured countless trials. Yet remarkably, it has always found a way to survive, emerging stronger and achieving astonishing victories. Adversaries who once stood against the CCP were left powerless in the face of its extraordinary fortune. Now, in May 2025, China is engaged in a tariff war with the United States, a contest of national strength and, some might argue, destiny. This economic battle, though free of gunfire, is no less brutal than a conventional war. Indeed, it may be even more ruthless. The nation that loses this struggle risks being consumed by crisis, reduced to a marginal, failed state, a desolate land of economic subjugation, with crumbling industries, social unrest, and collapsed public order, much like the struggling nations of Africa, trapped in perpetual turmoil. At this pivotal moment, does the CCP's remarkable luck still endure? Can it stage a comeback, decisively overcome the United States, and claim the mantle of the world's leading economic power? The CCP's origins lie in Soviet Russia's intervention in China. The Beiyang government's refusal to recognize the new Soviet regime prompted Lenin to seek its overthrow, cultivating pro-Russian forces in China. The Soviets pursued a dual strategy. In 1921, they established the Chinese Communist Party through Li Dazhao and Chen Duxiu, effectively a branch of the Russian Communist Party. Simultaneously, they partnered with Sun Yat-sen, reorganizing the Kuomintang in Guangzhou in 1923. The Soviets then allowed these two factions to compete, knowing that the rise of either to topple the Beiyang government would serve their interests. Initially, the Kuomintang held a clear advantage, while the CCP's position was marginal. By 1924, under Soviet directive, the CCP was compelled to merge entirely with the Kuomintang, working under its banner and supporting the Kuomintang's northern expedition in 1926. It's worth noting that, although led nominally by the Kuomintang, the northern expedition was wholly orchestrated by the Soviet Union. The expedition's forces were trained by Soviet instructors, equipped with Soviet weaponry, and, crucially, commanded by Soviet officers. Hundreds of Soviet military advisors were embedded at every level, down to company commands, overseeing all operations. Kuomintang officers, such as He Yingqin and Cheng Qian, were largely ceremonial, merely endorsing Soviet-issued orders. To put it plainly, the Northern Expedition Army was trained to Soviet standards, armed with Soviet equipment, and directed by Soviet officers. In both capability and organization, it far surpassed the fragmented Beiyang warlords who were outmatched on every front. The expedition's launch was a sweeping triumph, routing warlord forces with ease. Had history followed this course, the Northern Expedition would have swiftly defeated the Beiyang regime, unified China, and established a pro-Soviet government, potentially even a Soviet satellite state within the Soviet system. In such a scenario, the Chinese Communist Party would have had no purpose, no space to grow. Yet history took an unexpected turn. Chiang Kai-shek, the Kuomintang's leader, refused to submit to Soviet control or become a cog in their machine. Despite his flaws, Chiang possessed a fierce pride and resilience, unwilling to live as Moscow's subordinate. The notion of serving as the Soviet Union's pawn was intolerable to him. In early 1927, after defeating warlord factions under Sun Quanfang and Wu Peifu, the Northern Expedition secured the Yangtze River basin, establishing the Nanjing government, known as the Republic of China. At this juncture, Chiang decisively broke with the Soviets, halting their economic aid, expelling Soviet advisors, and on April 12, 1927, launching a sweeping purge of CCP members within the Kuomintang, known as the April 12th Purge. For the CCP, Chiang's betrayal of the Soviets was both a devastating blow and a unique opportunity. Had Chiang remained loyal to Moscow, the CCP would have faded into obscurity. But his defiance forced the Soviets to fully back the CCP, channeling all their resources into its survival and growth. In essence, the Kuomintang and CCP were sibling entities, both nurtured by Soviet support. The Kuomintang rose first, gained autonomy, and promptly turned on the Soviets. In response, the Soviets pivoted to the CCP, marking its first major crisis and its first chance to thrive. Indeed, Chiang's break with the Soviets was pivotal to the CCP's ability to repeatedly defy the odds in the ensuing years of conflict. With no other proxies in China, the Soviets had no choice but to double down on the CCP. For the CCP, survival hinged on breaching Chiang's blockades to secure Soviet aid, funds, weapons, and strategic supplies that flowed without limit. Stalin imposed no cap on this support. As long as supply lines held, the Chinese revolutionaries could take as much as needed. The CCP swiftly recovered from the purge, armed itself, and began launching armed uprisings, ushering in the era of Kuomintang-CCP rivalry. Chiang's Nanjing government relied heavily on commercial taxes from the Yangtze region, never extending its authority to rural areas or collecting agricultural taxes. The CCP, by contrast, enjoyed diverse revenue streams. It received boundless Soviet aid, essential supplies and weaponry, accessible as long as transport routes remained open. The CCP has openly acknowledged this history, documenting it extensively in its official records, with abundant research available for exploration. Concurrently, the CCP implemented land reforms, forcibly seizing land from landlords and redistributing it to impoverished farmers. Nominally, this granted farmers ownership, but in reality, they retained only enough to subsist, with the surplus surrendered to the Soviet-style base areas. With these two pillars of support, the CCP was virtually unassailable. Even if the Kuomintang scored temporary victories at great cost, any slackening of pressure allowed the CCP to regroup, break through encirclements, and ultimately prevail. The CCP's most precarious moment came in late 1935, when the Red Army, after the Long March, arrived in northern Shanxi. The northwest was dominated by Islamic Hui and Uyghur militias, and the CCP repeatedly failed to penetrate their territories to establish supply lines with the Soviets. In the harsh Yellow Earth Plateau, the CCP's land reform propaganda, promising land redistribution, fell flat. Local Han Chinese farmers rejected the rhetoric and land reform faltered. The CCP soon faced dire shortages, with its remaining soldiers starving and freezing, teetering on the brink of annihilation. But at this critical juncture, Chiang Kai-shek's perplexing decisions provided the CCP a lifeline. Inexplicably, he withdrew the Central Army units pursuing the CCP, assigning the final assault to Zhang Shuiliang's Northeast Army. Presumably, this was meant to grant the Northeast Army a share of glory and a long-term base in the Northwest to secure the frontier for the Kuomintang. The Northeast Army, however, was a demoralized force. Having surrendered Manchuria to the Japanese without resistance, it had lost all fighting spirit. Displaced from their homeland, the Northeast Army became a liability, fleeing at the first hint of battle, often before the enemy appeared, and dragging other units into retreat. Throughout the War of Resistance against Japan, any significant Northeast Army unit was a guaranteed point of collapse. Worse still was Zhang Shuiliang, a reckless and incompetent figure, arguably the most deplorable in modern Chinese history, more interested in personal indulgence than in the arduous task of defeating the CCP. With the Northeast Army as their adversary, the CCP's fortunes shifted dramatically. The Northeast Army's predictable defeats turned it into an unwitting supplier of weapons and supplies for the CCP. After a few losses, the Northeast Army proposed a truce, suggesting both sides stage a performance to deceive Chiang. Soon, they even assisted the CCP in establishing supply lines with the Soviets, connecting Yan'an to Moscow by land and regular air routes. The CCP's situation improved rapidly, enabling them to recruit local Shanxi men into the Red Army with newfound resources. This facade persisted until late 1936, when Chiang Kai-shek's patience with Zhang Shuiliang and the Northeast Army reached its limit. In early December, Chiang flew to Xi'an to personally oversee Zhang's replacement. Yet here, Chiang made another series of astonishing missteps. Replacing a general in the field has always been a delicate matter, prone to mutiny. If unavoidable, it requires utmost secrecy and caution, with measures to isolate the general's command. Chiang, however, showed no such prudence. News of Zhang's dismissal spread widely, known even to Xi'an street beggars. More astonishingly, on December 11th, Chiang hosted a grand banquet, inviting Zhang and others, where he publicly announced plans to strip Zhang of his military authority. Such blatant naivety practically invited rebellion. Sure enough, at dawn the next day, Zhang launched the Xi'an Incident, detaining Chiang in a world-shaking coup that became a turning point for the CCP. In the aftermath, Zhang's Northeast Army lacked the standing to negotiate. The CCP stepped in, engaging in 3 days and nights of talks with the Nanjing government. Ostensibly it was the CCP negotiating, but in reality it was the Soviet Union behind them, dealing with Nanjing. Facing pressure from Nazi Germany and Japan, the Soviets urgently needed China to counter Japanese aggression. The CCP, still a marginal force in Shanxi's hills, couldn't lead the fight. Thus, the Soviets needed Chiang's government to survive, meaning Chiang had to live. In exchange, Chiang had to grant the CCP leniency, allowing them to remain in the northwest. This marked the second Kuomintang-CCP cooperation. To provide Chiang a face-saving exit, the CCP pledged to suspend land reforms during the cooperation, halting the seizure of landlord property. In truth, land reform had already stalled in the northwest, making this an easy concession. Following the Xi'an Incident, the CCP gained legal recognition and its Red Army was reorganized as the 8th Route Army of the National Revolutionary Army. For the first time, the CCP had a legitimate identity and authority, free to operate openly, no longer an underground movement. Just 6 months later, on July 7, 1937, Japan launched its full-scale invasion of China, beginning with Beijing, triggering the War of Resistance. Over the next year, Chiang's government fought massive battles against the Japanese, involving hundreds of thousands of troops, including the North China Campaign, the Battle of Shanghai, the Battle of Taiwan, the Battle of Suzhou, and the Battle of Wuhan. By then, the front lines stabilized, with the Kuomintang losing North China, the Central Plains, and the mid-lower Yangtze, settling into a stalemate in Hunan and Hubei, where a 7-year struggle ensued. During this protracted conflict, the CCP gained unprecedented freedom to expand. Equipped with Soviet-supplied weapons, they moved beyond Shanxi, establishing the Jinchaji base in Hebei. When Japan advanced in the southeast, the CCP conducted guerrilla raids in the Hebei plains. These raids were highly effective. No matter how brutal Japan's sweeps, the CCP could evade them, untouchable. As soon as Japanese forces withdrew, the CCP would return, eliminating pro-Japanese collaborators and restoring control. Still, such guerrilla tactics alone couldn't elevate the CCP to prominence. When Japan surrendered in 1945, the CCP lacked the strength to challenge Chiang directly. Its true breakthrough came with the seizure of Manchuria. By 1945, Japan had spent 14 years transforming Manchuria into a hub of heavy industry and military production. Cities like Harbin, Heilongjiang, Shenyang, Changchun, and Dalian had become modern, surpassing any city in China, including Shanghai's famed 10-mile foreign concession. Manchuria accounted for 90% of China's steel production, 50% of its coal, and 80% of its electricity. Controlling Manchuria meant controlling China's destiny, a decisive factor in the power struggle. Both the CCP and Chiang employed every strategy to secure it. In mid-September 1945, the CCP dispatched 100,000 troops under Lin Biao from North China's liberated zones into Manchuria. Rather than seizing cities, they first absorbed remnants of Manchukuo's puppet army, swelling their ranks to 300,000. These puppet forces, trained by the Japanese, were a disciplined modern army, significantly enhancing the CCP's military strength. Chiang, blocked by the CCP's North China bases, couldn't send his central army directly to Manchuria. But he had a plan. In August 1945, his government signed the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship and Alliance, ceding Outer Mongolia in exchange for Soviet recognition of Chiang's claim to Manchuria. This gave Chiang nominal Soviet support and disrupted Soviet aid to the CCP. In November 1945, with the U.S. Pacific Fleet's assistance, Chiang transported hundreds of thousands of Central Army troops led by the formidable Du Yuming to Qinhuangdao. They marched north, occupying key areas with Soviet cooperation. Lin Biao's Northeast Army was powerless, retreating until cornered in Harbin, the frigid far north, on the brink of collapse. Had history followed this path, the Kuomintang-CCP struggle would have ended with the CCP's defeat. But history took an unexpected turn. Du Yuming could have pressed his advantage and destroyed Lin Biao's forces, but the U.S., seeking to mediate the Civil War, intervened. The U.S. opposed a Kuomintang monopoly or a total CCP defeat. Special Envoy George Marshall threatened to cut off aid, forcing Chiang to halt Du's advance. This gave Lin Biao's forces a reprieve in northern Harbin, and the tide began to turn in the CCP's favor. From mid-1946, U.S.-Soviet relations deteriorated rapidly, plunging into the Cold War by early 1947. Initially, the Soviets had little interest in supporting the CCP, but the global ideological divide forced their hand. The CCP and Soviets aligned, and the Soviets began pouring massive aid into Lin Biao's beleaguered forces in Manchuria's snowy forests, unlimited weapons and supplies, plus comprehensive reorganization and training. By May 1947, this transformed army, now 400,000 strong, was complete. Armed with captured Japanese heavy weapons transferred by the Soviets, Lin Biao's Northeast Field Army surpassed both other CCP forces and Chiang's National Revolutionary Army. Against this modern, heavily armed force, Chiang's troops were helpless, fleeing at the sight of the Northeast Army's advance. Tragically for Chiang, he failed to secure a place in the United States camp during the Cold War. President Truman abandoned Chiang's regime, refusing further aid. To Truman, Chiang's government, with its deep Soviet ties, from the Kuomintang Soviet-influenced founding to its wartime aid and Manchurian cooperation, seemed indistinguishable from the CCP. Their conflict appeared as an internal Soviet dispute. Regardless of the victor, the winner would likely align with Moscow, making Chiang an unworthy investment. From there, history unfolded predictably. Lin Biao's 400,000-strong army swept south from Manchuria to Hainan, conquering city after city, unstoppable. Chiang, unable to resist, fled to Taiwan, establishing a government in exile. On October 1, 1949, the CCP formally established its rule, securing the mainland. To conclude, let us reflect on the so-called miraculous luck that propelled the CCP from its founding to victory. First, the Soviet factor. With their growing power, supporting the CCP was a low-cost endeavor for the Soviets. With this inexhaustible benefactor, the CCP could recover from any setback, regrouping swiftly. Second, Chiang's incompetence. Whenever the CCP faced oblivion, Chiang would make astonishing blunders, offering them an escape. The Xi'an Incident stands as one of the most inexplicable stains on his legacy, surpassed only by his disastrous leadership in the Battle of Shanghai, where he squandered 1 million of the Kuomintang's finest troops. Third, the CCP's mobilization genius. Mao's land reform was a brutal but effective mechanism for rallying the masses. By dividing society into landlords, rich peasants, middle peasants, and poor peasants, the CCP vilified the wealthy, inciting the poor to attack them. Through coercion and promises, the poor were led to kill the rich and seize their property, binding themselves to the CCP through shared guilt and gain. These three elements explain the CCP's repeated ability to defy fate. But they were not eternal. Over time they eroded, and with them the CCP's luck began to wane. First, Sino-Soviet relations deteriorated after Stalin's death, escalating into armed clashes in the 1960s along the Heilongjiang and Xinjiang borders. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Russia, built on its ruins, became an oligarchic state. A handful of elites seized Soviet assets, dismantling the industrial base. Today's Russia, reduced to selling raw crude oil without refining capacity, can no longer support the CCP. In the past 3 years, Russia's war with Ukraine has depleted its resources. By now, Russia cannot sustain the conflict alone, relying on vast CCP-supplied war materials and tens of thousands of North Korean troops to hold the line. The United States-China economic war began on April 9, 2025, and this time the CCP faces America alone, without Soviet backing. Worse, Russia has become a burden, draining the CCP's resources. While confronting the United States, the CCP must divert aid to Russia to prevent its soldiers from starving on the Ukrainian front. Second, the opponent. The CCP now faces Donald Trump, a bold and outspoken figure who is far from foolish. Those who underestimated Trump have been swept aside by history. His philosophy is to seize every advantage, creating opportunities where none exist. Trump and his administration resent China's globalization successes, and expecting them to relent or ease tariffs at a critical moment is wishful thinking. In this contest, it is the CCP that falters repeatedly. While Trump delivers a relentless series of blows, high tariffs, crackdowns on transshipment trade, and bans on Chinese-built ships docking in U.S. ports. Each move strikes China's economic vulnerabilities, leaving the CCP stunned, paralyzed for weeks, and likely to remain so until the economy falters. Third, mobilization. Land reform was a one-time tool, unsustainable long-term. By the 1950s, China's landlords and rich peasants were eliminated, leaving no further targets. The CCP turned to the Cultural Revolution, inciting the poor to turn on each other in a frenzy of violence, tearing the nation apart. By the 1970s, this extreme mobilization model was exhausted. In the 1980s, the CCP shifted to wealth-driven mobilization, encouraging some to get rich first. Unsurprisingly, the first to prosper were the red elites with power. The decade saw rampant corruption, declining social trust, and the 1989 student protests. Students demanded equality and freedom but lacked deep insight or viable reforms, dooming their movement to failure. The 1990s brought economic stagnation. Western sanctions took their toll while domestic inflation soared. State-owned enterprises collapsed, leaving 50 million workers jobless with no prospects. Families faced starvation, crime surged, and society frayed. By the late 1990s, the CCP teetered on the brink of collapse, its rule unsustainable. The turning point came in 2000 when the U.S., thriving amid an IT boom, extended a lifeline. President Clinton agreed to China's WTO entry. When Clinton left office in early 2001, President George W. Bush showed little interest and negotiations stalled. But the 9/11 attacks shifted U.S. priorities to combating Islamic terrorism, softening its stance on China. WTO talks accelerated, and on December 11, 2001, China joined, making 45 commitments. That day marked a true turning point for Communist China's fortunes. Notably, the CCP has fulfilled only 23 of those 45 pledges, a 51.1% compliance rate. Regardless, WTO entry unleashed a flood of Western capital and industry into China, sparking a golden 15-year boom that established China as the world's manufacturing hub. Ironically, Islamic terrorists indirectly saved the CCP, yet 21st century China lacks true grassroots mobilization. Wealth-driven mobilization, encouraging wealth accumulation, functions only in economic upswings. In downturns, when foreign capital and industries vanish, consumption stalls and wealth accumulation fades, this model becomes a liability, undermining the nation. A population fixated on wealth loses purpose, either disengaging or resorting to random violence. Today, having lost its mobilization capacity, the CCP relies solely on suppression, banning speech, investment, movement, gatherings, publishing, and all grassroots organizing. But suppression cannot rally people to confront the U.S. In the ongoing economic war. This prohibitive approach is ineffective, akin to capitulation. In summary, the CCP now stands without a benefactor, facing a formidable opponent in America and lacking any mobilization capacity. The three pillars of its once remarkable luck have vanished. If it holds one remaining card, it is this harsh reality: China can endure mass suffering. Even if 700 million face starvation, the CCP assumes the people will not revolt. Such is the stark truth of their final stand.